The subject of this lecture is the Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, about whom we know a lot less than we would like to. We know that she came from a remote branch of the Fujiwara family, which ruled Japan through successive emperors through most of the Heian period. It was called the Heian period because its capital city was Heian, which is present-day Kyoto. We know that her father held several minor court posts and twice was a provincial governor. All we know about her childhood is from a diary that she kept much later, in which she recalls that her father had noticed how bright she was as a child and had said many times that he wished that she had been born a boy. We also know that from just listening in on her brother's Chinese lessons, she actually learned Chinese. It was an achievement that she later suppressed because it was considered unseemly for a woman to be able to understand Chinese. She may have accompanied her father to the provinces. Somewhere in 998 or 999, she married a distant kinsman who already had other wives and who was considerably older than she was. She had a daughter in 999, and then her husband died 2 years later. She went to court in attendance on the Empress about 1005. The big events in her diary from the years 1008 to 1010 were the births of two sons to the Empress, both of whom later on went on to become emperors themselves. The Empress was widowed in 1011, and we pretty much lose track of Murasaki after that. She may have stayed on at court for a while, and she may have died soon after. Her death dates are usually given as something like 1015 or 1016. And her novel was probably written between her husband's death in 999 and her retirement from court, or her death, whichever came last. The story is about a Genji. A Genji is a son of an emperor who has been made legally a commoner. The primary purpose of doing this, of taking an emperor's son and making him a commoner, was a way of cutting down on expenses for all the big retinues that had to be kept for crown princes, of which there would have been many given the sexual access that the emperor had to a large number of women. So you cut down expenses by making some of them ineligible to succeed to the throne. In Genji's case, it's also done to protect him. His mother was a great favorite of the Empress, one for whom he had developed a kind of obsessive passion, but who was a relative nobody, who had no strong family backings, and in fact, his mother was really hounded to death shortly after Genji's birth by the emperor's first wife and other more powerful women at court. So Genji is orphaned early, without strong family backing, but loved by the emperor because of his mother. He would have been the center of intrigues and danger all of his life. So the emperor makes him a commoner without a claim to the throne. Genji is the one who holds this entire novel together. As we said, he is the child of a great passion between the emperor and a lady not of the first rank, who is then hounded to death by jealous rivals at court. His enemies will be the same ones who killed her, especially the lady Kokiden, the emperor's first wife, and a Fujiwara. The emperor mourns the death of Genji's mother in a way that most people at court consider excessive. And he continues to mourn until he finds a certain lady Fuchitsubo so like Genji's mother that she becomes a kind of substitute in the emperor's affections. She also exercises a really strong fascination for Genji, who was too young to remember his mother. He was too young when she died. And so this woman, the lady Fuchitsubo, becomes a kind of mother substitute for him, and as we'll see later on, she becomes something more than that as well. Genji grows up beautiful and bright and sensitive, so much so that even his enemies at court are won over by his beauty and his charm. When he gets to be 12 years old, he passes his coming-of-age ceremony, and he's immediately married off to Aoi, a daughter of a powerful minister at court. She's a few years older than he is. She's about 14 or 15, and it's a purely political match. He doesn't spend very much time with her, and she doesn't bear a son until quite a few years later, shortly after which she dies. When Genji is 18, he meets a young girl named Murasaki, who's then 9 years old, who reminds him of the emperor's wife, the lady Fuchitsubo, and in fact, she is the lady Fuchitsubo's niece. And Genji has been fascinated with that lady for many years now, and so when he sees Murasaki, he's immediately fascinated with her too. He brings Murasaki into his household, and after the death of his first wife, Aoi, he makes her his first wife, despite the fact that she has no political significance whatsoever. At about the same time, the lady Fuchisubo makes one slip, which allows Genji to make love to her. She gets pregnant and eventually bears a son. They manage to hide the secret of the child's paternity from the emperor. The child is presumed to be the emperor's son, and he will in fact one day become an emperor himself. Along the way, Genji has affairs with various other ladies. One of them is the sister of Lady Kokiden, the woman who hounded Genji's mother to death. Lady Kokiden hates Genji, and the sister with whom Genji has the affair has been promised as a first wife to the crown prince. So the affair, when the Lady Kokiden finds out about it, lands Genji in some really serious trouble. At about the same time, his first wife, Aoi, has a son, Yugiri, and then she dies. On returning from her funeral, Genji makes love to Murasaki for the first time and then makes her his first wife. Genji's affair with the Lady Kokiden's sister is discovered about the same time that Genji's father retires as emperor and then dies shortly after. Genji is now in even bigger trouble because he doesn't have a father as emperor to protect him anymore, and so he banishes himself to Suma for a while. The ostensible reason for his banishment is the affair with the Lady Kokiden's sister, but Genji has also been for a long while troubled by his affair with the Lady Fuchisubo, his father's wife, and a kind of mother substitute for himself, so he has a good deal to be troubled about in that relationship. While he's in exile, he has an affair with a priest's daughter, which is really virtually thrust upon him. Even the Akashi lady, as she's called from here on, is reluctant, but her father, a priest, has great plans for his daughter, and he virtually forces the two together. The affair produces a daughter. After another change in emperor, Genji is called back to court, and he takes the Lady Akashi with him, along with their daughter, back to court. That daughter will eventually marry an emperor and become a mother to a future emperor, so that Genji manages to father one emperor and to grandfather another, despite his own exclusion from succession. Genji's son by the Lady Fuchisubo now becomes emperor, and Genji arranges as the new emperor's first wife the daughter of one of his former lovers, the Lady Rokujo. This marks, in a way, the kind of height of Genji's political power, the height of his career. He's creates a mansion for his women. He's got 4 of them now, and he divides his mansion up into 4 courts: spring, summer, fall, and winter. Murasaki, his first and favorite wife, of course, gets the spring court. We remember from our lecture on the Manyoshu and the Kinshu that spring is the Japanese favorite season. But the height of his political power coincides pretty precisely with a gradual loss of control in his personal one. He brings home, but fails to establish, a sexual relationship with Tamakazura, a daughter of one of his former lovers, one who died in very mysterious circumstances in his arms on a stormy night some years ago. Tamakazura resists him in part by suggesting that he's too old for her and for such unseemliness. At the same time, his new wife is unfaithful to him and bears a son to the son of Genji's best friend. When he finds out about it, Genji sees it as kind of just retribution for what he had done to the emperor, his father, many years earlier. Genji lives to be 52, long enough to see the Akashi lady's daughter married to an emperor and to bear a son who will one day be emperor himself. But at the same time, Murasaki falls ill. Genji takes her to another one of his estates and tends her in her last illness himself. And it's his absence that allows access to his third wife, which produces a son, which everyone assumes to be Genji's. After Murasaki's death, Genji himself lives only 1 more year, and then the novel traces the career of his flawed descendants, each of whom has inherited something of Genji's shining qualities, but none of whom is like the magnificent Genji himself. In this bald kind of plot summary, which I really, really oversimplified as well. This sounds like soap opera. But, and in a way, the plot is sort of soap opera-ish. But the novel has been praised for nearly 1,000 years for the way that it analyzes love and love relationships in psychological ways that still resonate with modern readers. In order to appreciate this psychological analysis, I think, we have to, however, keep in mind some differences between gender relations at the high-end court in those days and the kind of gender relations that we're used to in the modern world ourselves. A couple of points to remember. One, marriage, at least for male aristocrats, was polygamous. A first marriage was usually arranged by parents, and it usually occurred when the boy and girl were about 12 or 13. This is exactly what happens to Genji in the novel. Since people, a boy and girl being married at 12 and 13, are still really partly children, the girl would stay with her parents and the boy would come to visit her. Second and third wives were usually given their own establishments, and then a man would commute from one wife to another, stopping sometimes for liaisons along the way. What women did in the meantime was to wait, usually hidden behind screens or blinds, for a man to show up, spending a lot of hours gazing out into rainy gardens. The arrangements allowed some freedom for both men and women, more for men obviously than for women, but women could be visited by other men while their husbands were away. Genji does this many times earlier in the novel, and later in the novel it's done to him too. While he's tending Murasaki in her last illness, the son of his best friend has an affair with his third wife. Still, the situation, the arrangement was harder for women than it is for men, since they could inspire passion, but they couldn't initiate it. They could only wait for a man to penetrate her screen, and if he didn't, to wonder why not. Her isolation, the isolation of an aristocratic woman in these circumstances, was complete enough that the verb to see in Japanese can also mean to have sexual relations with. Remember, this is comparable to that verb to know in the Old Testament, which means to know means to have sexual relations with. Here, the verb to see functions in pretty much the same way. Early in the novel, Genji sees other women, and then his own women are seen by other men as his control slips as he grows older. Women's only recourse in this situation was jealousy against the man who kept, against the other woman who kept her man from coming through her screen. And there's one recurring character in the novel who illustrates this motif of jealousy very, very well. Early in the novel, Genji has a brief but passionate relationship with a woman who dies one night in a strange house to which he's taken her in the midst of a great storm. The death is a very mysterious one. She dies, we are told, possessed by a malign spirit. Later on in the novel, we find that that malign spirit was that of Lady Rokujo, a slightly older woman who was obsessed with Genji and very jealous of her rivals. Her jealousy recurs throughout the novel. It even continues after her death. It's one of the most destructive elements in the entire novel. It's Lady Rokujo's spirit that kills Aoi, Genji's first wife, and later it also kills Murasaki, even after the Lady Rokujo herself has been dead a long time. Genji had had an affair with her, but when he starts cooling toward her, she becomes fiercely jealous of all the women that he associates with. Murasaki Shikibu probably believed literally in spirits like this, so it's not a violation of credibility in the ambience of the novel itself. But if, as you read the novel, what you'll see is that all of these episodes are handled in such a way that we can read them as expressions of the psychological power of hate or jealousy to harm and to kill, and so they make sense to modern readers as well. But if sequestered women had to wait mostly for men to show up and could only have jealousy or hatred as a kind of weapon to use against women who kept their men from showing up, they also had time to write. And it's maybe one of the reasons why there are so many women writers from this period. In particular, this period is rich with women's diaries, diaries which paid little attention to politics, which was, after all, the man's sphere, after all. but recorded the private sides of life. In this period, the Japanese word for female also meant private, and so to say that women were writing about the private side of life in a way becomes a kind of redundant saying in Japanese. Richard Bowring, in his book on the Tale of Genji in the Landmarks of Literature series, says this about women writers in the period. These writings by women are some of the earliest examples of the attempt by women living in a male-dominated society to define the self in textual terms. Indeed, it is largely because of these works that classical Japanese becomes of more than parochial interest. As a result, the Heian period as a whole will always bear for us a strong female aspect. To a great extent, it is the women who are the source of our historical knowledge. They have become our historians, and it is they who define the parameters within which we are permitted to approach their world and their men. In retrospect, it is a form of sweet revenge. Okay, if we ask the question about what is it that holds this vast 1,000-page novel together, the answer is probably not structure. It's not entirely the plot. Most critics have decided, and I think you'll probably sense this yourself as you're reading it, that Murasaki really didn't have a clear sense of where this novel was going when it started. She simply began writing, and it grew sort of organically over time. And so that it isn't the structure of the novel that holds all this together. Rather, what critics and scholars have identified is a series of attitudes or of moods or of themes which sort of permeate the novel, even when it takes off in odd directions and goes off in some direction that we weren't expecting, which manages to hold all of this together. One idea that permeates the entire novel is the effort to establish a real relationship with another person. The second chapter in the book is a bull session on a rainy night in Genji's rooms. A group of young men, all about 17 years old, are sitting around and they're all talking about their experiences with women. And in the process, they're trying to define the perfect woman. Like an overture, this chapter suggests the entire novel will be in some ways a search for that perfect woman. But critics have also suggested that the novel also might be Murasaki's search for the perfect man. She was on intimate terms with the Empress during these days, and it's not difficult to imagine the Empress and Murasaki sitting down some night and just talking about imagining what a perfect man would be, one who wouldn't disappoint, a man who would grow into perfection the longer you got to know him. Initially in the novel, Genji seems to be that man. He's beautiful, he's sensitive, he's intelligent, and he seems really to understand women so that when he focuses on one, he's absolutely irresistible. But the story also darkens as time passes. We discover that Genji can be selfish and insensitive on occasion, and he does get older, so that when he trains his attention on young Tamakazura at the end of the novel, she finds his attentions offensive and deflects him. When this happens, it comes as a shock to the reader as well as to Genji, because such a thing would never ever have happened to the young Genji. There he got whoever he wanted. By the time he dies, 2/3 of the way through the novel, the brightness of the early stages of the novel have darkened. Edward G. Zeidensticker, a translator of the novel, says this about in his preface, and he talks about the novel actually being divided up into 3 parts and what the relationship between these 3 parts are. Here's his quote. "The tale of Genji quite clearly breaks in two with Genji's death. But there is an earlier break as Genji goes into his middle and late 40s. If the book may thus be thought of as falling into 3 parts, the first part still has a great deal of the 10th century in it. The hero is an idealized prince, and though there are setbacks, his early career is essentially a success story. Then, some 2/3 of the way through the sections dominated by Genji, there comes a tidying up and packing away of things, as by someone getting ready to move on. And the matter of the last 8 chapters before Genji's disappearance from the scene is rather different. Enough of romancing, Murasaki Shikibu seems to say, and one may imagine that she is leaving her own youth behind. The sad things are the real things. Shadows gather over Genji's life. The action is altogether less grand and more intimate, the characterization more subtle and compelling than in the first section. Then suddenly Genji is dead. Once more, and very boldly this time, Murasaki Shikibu has moved on. After the 3 transitional chapters come what are generally called the Uji chapters. The pessimism grows, the main action moves from the capital to the village of Uji. Both character and action are more attenuated, and Murasaki Shikibu has a try, and many will say succeeds, at a most extraordinary thing, the creation of the first anti-hero in the literature of the world. So that what he suggests is that there is a gradual darkening, a 3-stage darkening of the brightness with which the novel begins. Some critics have said that it's probably Buddhism that colors this last section, with its teaching that desire itself is a bad thing. The novel opens with an act of passion in the emperor's excessive love for that lady not of the first rank. And that may very well be a kind of original sin from which Genji is born. Genji himself is guilty of more than one such lapse during the course of the novel. And so perhaps the last stages of the novel simply trace the effects of desire, which in any case is not only bad, but is always, in Buddhist terms, incapable of fulfillment. The idea of unrealizable desire is already sounded in that bull session in chapter 2. In part of that bull session, again from the same translation, we get this. I fear there is nothing that would interest you. To no Chujo was in a contemplative mood. It is with women as it is with everything else. The flawless ones are very few indeed. This is a sad fact which I have learned over the years. All manner of women seem presentable enough at first. Little notes, replies to this and that, they all suggest sensibility and cultivation. But when you begin sorting out the really superior ones, you find that there are not many who have to be on your list. Each has her little tricks, and she makes the most of them, getting in her slights at rivals, so broad sometimes that you almost have to blush. Hidden away by loving parents who build brilliant futures for them, they let word get out of this little talent and that little accomplishment, and you are all in a stir. They are young and pretty and amiable and carefree, and in their boredom they begin to pick up a little from their elders, and in the natural course of things they begin to concentrate on one particular hobby and make something of it. A woman tells you all about it and hides the weak points and brings out the strong ones as if they were everything, and you can't very well call her a liar. So you begin keeping company, and it's always the same. The fact is not up to the advanced notices. Well, that may be Buddhist, but it doesn't have to be. What it simply suggests is this growing sadness, this darkening of tone across time, which may be Buddhist and may not. Donald Keene, in his book, The Pleasures of Japanese Literature, quotes a Japanese critic in this way. And this Japanese critic is saying, this book can't possibly be Buddhist for reasons that he enunciates here. There have been many interpretations over the years of the purpose of this tale, but all of these interpretations have been based not on a consideration of the novel itself, but rather on the novel as seen from the point of view of Confucian and Buddhist works, and thus do not represent the true purpose of the author. Good and evil, as found in this tale, do not correspond to good and evil as found in Confucian and Buddhist writings. Generally speaking, those who know the meaning of the sorrow of human existence, that is, those who are in sympathy and in harmony with human sentiments, are regarded as good. And those who are not aware of the poignance of human existence, those who are not in harmony with human sentiments, are regarded as bad. Man's feelings do not always follow the dictates of his mind. They arise in man in spite of himself and are difficult to control. In the instance of Prince Genji, his interest in and meetings with various women, including the imperial consort Fuchisubo, are acts of extraordinary iniquity and immorality, according to the Confucian and Buddhist points of view. It would be difficult to call Prince Genji a good man, however numerous his other admirable qualities. But the Tale of Genji does not dwell on his iniquities and immoral acts, but rather recites again and again his awareness of the sorrow of existence, and represents him as a good man who combines in himself all good things in men. Later, this same Japanese critic, cited by Donald Keene, says that you might think of the novel as like that of a man who collects a lot of muddy water in which he intends to grow lotuses. Because everything that happens in the novel, he says, is not there for its own sake, but for nurturing that awareness of human sorrow, which he thinks this novel is all about. The Japanese phrase for this is mono no aware, which means a sensitivity to things, which Genji always has, despite his flaws, and which the novel has in such abundance that it remains one of the most important works of literature in all of Japanese history. In the next lecture, we will move ahead to the west, back to the west, and about 300 years to Italy, where Dante was composing his great masterpiece of Christian epic poetry, the Divine Comedy. But before we leave Japan, we need to notice how different Genji is as a hero from the heroes that we have looked at so far in this course. For one thing, he's not a warrior. His skills are the skills of poetry and painting and knowing what to wear for each occasion, and an amazing sensitivity to the needs of women. In some ways, he's more like the knights of medieval romance than he is like the heroes we've looked at so far, maybe a little like Lancelot, who was also expected to be able to turn out a respectable poem, to show good manners, to be sensitive to women's needs, not very much like Achilles or Arjuna or Beowulf. And as you'll also notice, this is a point that we mentioned in the last lecture and I wanted to come back and pick up. As you'll notice, Genji has within it about 800 poems, mostly from the Kokinshu, and used in many of the same ways that poetry was used in China, to help break the ice or make an excuse, or to say something that would be difficult or embarrassing to say in one's own voice. The woman who dies in mysterious circumstances in Genji's arms introduces herself to Genji with a poem written on a fan that she sends him. And he can tell from her choice of poems as well as from the calligraphy that she is a woman of taste worth a second look. And so she gets the second look and they become lovers, and later she dies mysteriously in his arms. This outlook, this use of poetry, this attitude toward poetry would change in Japan in the coming age of the samurai. But for now, Japan and China were the centers of a literature in which taste and education, breeding and manners mattered a lot more than how many men one could kill in an afternoon. Perhaps it's one of the reasons why, in ages to come, this period in both cultures was looked back on as a golden age. But that will end our brief visit to Japan for a while. As we said, in our next lecture, we will be back to Europe. We will jump ahead about 300 years, and there we will come across the great masterpiece of the European Middle Ages in Dante's Divine Comedy.